So welcome everybody to this last SSAHE webinar of the academic year 23-24, but not our last event. As I'll say a little bit about later, we're going to have an in-person event in June. My name is Ben Gidley. I'm in the School of Social Sciences at Birkbeck University in London. I'm part of the founding members of SSAHE. Tonight's event is around the hostile environment and the right to protest and the policing of the right to protest. We've been living in a period under a conservative government who've been increasingly criminalising protest, and in doing so have often targeted migrants and racialised minorities. And that's a picture which is replicated across Europe and North America as well. And so this webinar tonight is around this dynamic of criminalization and how the criminalization of protest is related to the hostile environment against migrants and racialized minorities, both from the perspective of critical social science perspectives, critical criminology and sociology, and from the perspective of activists on the ground. I think the context that we're working in is one in which new definitions of extremism have been developed. The government have put into place and are proposing further legal tools to be used against protest. Political actors have interfered in the policing of protests. Activists have been demonized, often in racializing language, and different forms of protest have been policed in radically different ways with, very uneven standards, which again have restricted the right to protest. It's in particular anti-racist and anti-fascist activists, Black Lives Matter movement, for example, people fighting against deportation, as well as Palestine solidarity and environmental justice activists who have experienced the sharp edge of these policies. And the purpose of tonight is to look at how we can understand these changes, how we can relate them to the kind of bigger picture of politics of the UK and in Europe, but also how we can think about forging new forms of solidarity, new forms of self-defense at a time when we need to kind of fight hard for the right to protest. So we've got some fantastic speakers tonight. We're going to start with Erin Winter, move on to Liz Fekete, and hopefully we'll be joined by Amardeep Singh Dillon, who's just checking the participants, not yet in the room, but hopefully will join us. And so I'll introduce them each one by one before they speak, and they're going to speak for about a quarter of an hour each. And so Erin Winter is a senior lecturer in sociology at Lancaster University and also the director of the Centre for Alternatives to Social and Economic Inequalities at Lancaster. He's been active in SSAHE since we were founded. His research is on the far right, focus on racism, mainstreaming violence. Hopefully many of you will know his book with Aurelian Mondon, Reactionary Democracy. He's also a co-editor of Identities. So I'll hand over straight away to Erin. Just add your back.
All right, thank you very much, Ben. So when I started discussing this topic with colleagues and friends in social sciences against the hostile environment, it was back in 2021 in the middle of a series of COVID lockdowns and the wake of protests challenging racism, misogyny, and increasing authoritarian state power, as well as both state and far-right backlashes to them. Most notably, Black Lives Matter in 2020, 2021, the Sarah Everard vigil, which was not a protest, but there was quite a brutal crackdown, and the Kill the Bill protests in Bristol and elsewhere in 2020, 2021. The Kill the Bill protests were in opposition to the police crime sentencing and court bill, which in addition to introducing harsher penalties, prevents unauthorized encampments and gives greater discretion to police handling protests. The police will no longer be required to determine that a demonstration could result in serious public disorder, public property damage, or serious disruption to the life of the community before it can impose restrictions, but allow them to criminalize protests they see as a public nuisance. According to Shami Chakrabarti, to quote, under the new measures, They would be able to stop and search people without suspicion, not because they feared knife crime or terrorism, but because they fear noise and impact and disruption, which of course is inherent to any peaceful, nonviolent protest. The new measures, again to quote, give ever broader power to the Home Secretary and the police to shut down peaceful dissent, voices with which the government does not agree. It's one law for those with whom the government agrees and another for everyone else. It has since become an act. And several other things have occurred in the time between then and now, which have informed my thinking and I think increased the urgency of this discussion. The first is genocide in Gaza and crackdowns on protesters and protests against it, which I'll come back to and focus on. The second is a Channel 4 documentary series, Defiance, Fighting the Far Right. It tells the story of racist attacks on Asian communities in Southall, Walthamstow, Bradford, and Brick Lane, the mobilization of the National Front, police and state racism, organizing and protest against these by the communities and Asian youth movements in the 1970s. Despite it being about the past, about a time that many today, through rose-tinted post-racial or liberal racist lenses, see as representing the real racism that we have now progressed beyond. The parallels and political return to the ideas and practices of this time, and thus its relevance, are inescapable. This includes the mobilization of the far right, as well as anti-racist left-wing protest, and the representation and criminalization of the latter as violent and extremist by the media, police, and political establishment, who often share a racial national identity, political ideology, and interests with the far right. Okay, even if it's historically in a slightly more moderate and acceptable mainstream form, framed as a rejection of their tactics, but acknowledgement of their legitimate grievances about, amongst other things, migrants and left-wing activism. We saw this in the context of Brexit, against Black Lives Matter, and now trained on migrants and pro-Palestinian protesters. And this overlaps in several and intersects in several ways. Now, in response to these protests we've seen recently, we have heard how threatening and dangerous they allegedly are. The campaign against anti-Semitism. According to the campaign against anti-Semitism, British Jews felt forced to hide during the protests in London. Former Home Secretary Suella Braverman called them hate marches. The Standard claimed Jewish Londoners make plans to flee the capital, with an image on their front cover evoking Kristallnacht. The article followed the release of a Community Security Trust report on the rise of anti-Semitism and analysis from the SSAHE, the campaign, who attributed this to individual attacks on the community and MPs, anti-Semitism in universities, and Palestinian solidarity protests, which they termed mass intimidation. What also concerns me about this understanding of anti-Semitism and the protests is that it often conflates anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, as well as Jews in Israel, operates in defense of Israel in general and its assault on Gaza in particular, and focused on that coming from Muslims, the left, and pro-Palestinian solidarity and anti-Zionist activists. It also evokes immigration, extremism, and terrorism, and thereby operationalizes the hostile environment, counter-extremism, and counter-terrorism, undermining democratic rights to and criminalizing or securitizing protest, as well as migration, asylum, and refugee rights. As we're seeing in Germany, where pro-Palestinian organizations and migrants are being targeted, and the US, where the House of Representatives passed a resolution that defines anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. The NYPD counterterrorism forces were deployed on Columbia University campus. There are widespread calls for the National Guard to be mobilized, forgetting the lessons of Kent State. And international students are being suspended and in danger of deportation. And of course, the UK, with its Islamophobia, hostile environment, the IHRA, and Prevent. In a 1st of March speech at number 10, in the wake of the CST report and George Galloway's election win in Rochdale, attributed to anger over the government and Labour's positions on Gaza and the Muslim vote, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak condemned what he said is what he called a shocking increase in extremist disruption and criminality since the 7th of October. The same week, the government counterterrorism czar Robin Simcox, of all people and positions, reiterated the line that protests are making London a no-go zone for Jews. And Community Secretaries Michael Gove unveiled a new definition of extremism. This led to fears soon realized that an already securitized Muslim community would be targeted. Despite the demonization of protests and protesters, Sunak and Gove did try to sort of rescue some benefit of the doubt from increasingly alienated constituencies, with Gove warning what he called good-hearted supporters of Palestinians. Don't let the extremists hijack your marches, he said. The new definition also targeted the far right, but of course, along with anti-fascists and socialists who are seen as opposition to Zionism, immigration, the far right, and the government. Now, the relationship between these latter two is particularly important, where Palestine, migration, and protest meet. As already noted, Braverman referred to hate marches. She unironically demanded the one planned for Armistice Day be called off in respect to the military and national traditions, and accused the police of being too woke to oppose and manage it. Many saw this as dog whistling to the far right due to the symbolism and references to nation, patriotism, the military, wokeness, and suspicion of the police, the latter of which has been evoked in the context of anti-grooming activists and protests targeting Muslims, Asians, and migrants, led by the English Defence League, which she has also been accused of encouraging. At the Armistice Day march, far-right activists and football hooligans, led by former EDL leader Tommy Robinson, or Stephen Yaxley Lennon, staged a counter-protest posing as an anti-hate and defenders of the nation group. They stormed the barricades and clashed with police guarding the cenotaph, leaving 9 officers injured and 82 counter-protesters arrested. The Met condemned what they called the extreme violence from right-wing protesters, and Sunak said, "I condemn the violent, wholly unacceptable scenes we have seen here today from the EDL and associated groups and Hamas supporters, sympathizers attending the National March for Palestine," making sure, like the new extremism definition, that he both sides it. It may also have been that which was informing the sort of the hijack comments, that these marches had been hijacked. Yet these hijackings were not equal or comparable. In one case, it was a Home Secretary that encouraged the far right to counter a legitimate protest that was represented as anti-Semitic, anti-British, Hamas-supporting, extremist, and violent. Even if Sunak and Gove now implied the latter was only a minority, fringe minority, it was one that stigmatized and impacted the national marches and Palestinian solidarity due to an imbalance of power and mainstream political representation, which the far right has. Despite this, the far right still caused a problem and carried a stigma, partly for which Braverman was sacked. Although the hijacking comment could have also been referred to the far right attending CA's March Against Anti-Semitism, as did Braverman. Armistice Day was not the first time she had played a role in far right activism. One notable case was the February 2023 attack on a hotel housing asylum seekers in Merseyside. The attack occurred in the context of the legitimization, mainstreaming, and emboldening of the far right by government policy and rhetoric, including Braverman referring to asylum seekers using fascist terms such as swarm and invasion. When she did condemn it, after much pressure, Braverman said, to quote, "The alleged behavior of some asylum seekers is never an excuse for violence, and violence is not the way we resolve this," blaming the victims and reiterating the far-right narrative about migrants, refugees, asylum seekers targeting white British women. She also expressed sympathy for the public and police, but not those targeted. A month later, in March, Braverman introduced the illegal migration bill to stop migrants crossing the channel by arresting, detaining, and repatriating or deporting them, a long-standing far-right trope. Braverman's most high-profile policy had been the deportation of failed asylum seekers to Rwanda. Taunting her critics and those that would be targeted, she referred to the possible start of flights as her dream. This would, of course, not happen before she was sacked, as both courts deemed the policy unlawful. Many suspect it was this, and not just the far right, that led to her sacking. As Aurelian Mondon and I argue in our work, liberal democracies have long exceptionalized and displaced racism, onto illiberal individuals, extremists like the far right, or a period of history and sort of tragic extreme events like the Holocaust, in a way that prevents the system and wider mainstream from being implicated. At the same time, it often uses the potential threat of these far-right violence or an electoral victory by the far right to justify more moderate, acceptable versions of their ideas, such as those about immigration. We saw this with Thatcher's swamped rhetoric in response to the National Front, and around Brexit, with the white working class left behind being constructed as both potential supporters for the far right and representative of the so-called will of the people, in ways that necessitated the representation of them and their alleged grievances. After the hotel attack, many argued the way to prevent incidents such as this was to resolve the immigration crisis and push increasingly harsh policies, which, as we know, and Mondon and I argue, only legitimizes mainstreams and emboldens the far right further, which is why the increasing sort of escalation of more mainstream and so-called moderate far-right ideas becomes increasingly extreme and doesn't push the far right off the map. This government barely conceals the blurry lines between illiberal and liberal racism and the far right and the mainstream. The irony with Braverman is her association with the far right and extreme rhetoric allowed Sunak to think he could cast her out as an illiberal racist, not his words, all the while leaving the policies in place as the Rwanda plan is. In his 2021 review of Prevent, William Shawcross revealed this, responding to increased far-right referrals, which were used to show it is not anti-Muslim and the government does care about the threat of the far right. Shawcross argued the far-right threat is overblown and distracts from the more urgent focus on what he called Islamism. Plus, he argued it would be difficult distinguishing between the far and the mainstream right. As such, if the far right is targeted because they are inconvenient or an easy scapegoat for society's racism and fascism, the bias is still against Muslims, migrants, anti-racist, anti-fascist, anti-Zionist, and left-wing activism and protest. As such, the new Policing Act and this new definition of extremism, particularly in concert, pose serious risks for them and us. Our rights and causes, including an end to deaths in the Channel, an end to deportations, and an end to genocide in Gaza. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Aaron. And thank you for being so concise and packing so much in. It's really appreciated. I'm going to hand over to our next speaker now, Liz. And if people have questions, make sure you kind of keep them, for Aaron, make sure you keep them in your head so that we can bring them into discussion afterwards. So Liz is the Director of the Institute for Race Relations, who've worked with social scientists against the hostile environment and a couple of our webinars now, and we're very privileged to have that connection. She's the author of Europe's Fault Lines, Racism and the Rise of the Right, which won the Bread and Roses Award for Radical Publishing in 2019, and is going to be talking tonight about the media-generated hostile environment faced by the Palestinian diaspora in Europe. So, Liz, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. Can you hear me? I'm not muted, am I? Sorry, I'm technologically a complete ignoramus.
Clearly.
Thanks so much for the invitation, Ben, Anne and Nira. As soon as Anne contacted me, although I actually have to be in another meeting, I'm trying to be in two places at once today, but as soon as she contacted me, I knew that I wanted to be here because the hostile environment policies are so malleable, and we're seeing how they can easily be extended and rolled out for different communities. Migrants, we're seeing the whole attack on disabled people and also the attack on Palestine solidarity. So I think the first point I want to make is that hostile environment policies designed first to drive migrants out of the country are being directed at the Palestinian diaspora across Europe, whose very identity and existence is being vilified by sections of the media and criminalised by the state in an attempt to force them out of public life. Aggressive restrictions on the right to protest and hostile measures, not just on the streets, but in universities and cultural institutions, is now the norm across Europe. And I don't have to tell the social scientists against the hostile environment that this is not just a civil liberties issue. It's not just about the right to protest. It's an anti-racism issue, and it's an issue of racial justice. So in what I'm going to say, what I'm going to do is make 3 general points about how the hostile environment against Palestinian works in practice. I'm going to make that in relation to the media, in relation to the police, and also in the relation to the creation of new norms about hate crimes, which flows into the points that both Ben and Aaron have made about the context for our discussions is new definitions of extremism, but actually even not official definitions or officially recognized definitions might not be part of the law, but are now becoming the norm about hate speech and hate crimes. And I'm going to finish by talking about the case of Dr. Naderi Shalhoub-Kevokian, whose case I think is emblematic of the way that the hostile environments against those without full citizenship and the hostile environment against Palestinians now interacts. What I'm talking about has been the basis of a lot of interventions that we've done on IRR News and we continue to do. And I'd encourage you to sign up to that if you aren't already signed up to that. And also a piece that I've written for our journal, Race and Class. Now, you're academics, we're published by SAGE. I don't know when that will be online, but what I can say is that you're getting the first preview. And here I'm working with a definition of anti-Palestinian racism, which is actually the European Legal Support Centre definition, which I think is very useful. Anti-Palestinian racism is a form of racism that aims to silence, exclude, stereotype or defame Palestinians and their narrative. That's the definition I'm using. Please keep it in mind and think about how it relates to everything that I'm going to say now. I'll try and keep it in mind too. So the first point that I want to make is, how is the hostile environment against Palestinians enforced? Through the media, of course, as it always is. The media provides the alibi for laws, measures and norms that institutionalise anti-Palestinian racism. It's the media that is whipping up a moral panic against Palestine solidarity protests as a disruptive force and an expensive political nuisance, with visible displays of support for a free Palestine, such as a flag and the kafaya equated with anti-Semitism. The ways in which the media slurs those who speak out against genocide as Israel haters and anti-Semite relies on the weaponization of definitions and terms. Crucially, the 2016 International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism that conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. Let me give you some examples from Germany and the UK. The German press have launched a widespread attack on the Palestinian and Arab communities, particularly in Berlin, depicting them as the sole bearers of anti-Semitism, although by any measure and in all the statistics, the overwhelming majority of anti-Semitic incidents in Germany are carried out by the far right. The Die Welt had a podcast entitled "Free Palestine is the New Heil Hitler," and the Bild newspaper led a campaign to revoke the passport of a young Palestinian woman after she posted an image on social media that referred to Palestine from the river to the sea. The UK media are also campaigning to criminalise the refrain "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." In doing this, they center the narratives of Israeli officials and commentators who claim that the slogan is a call for the genocide of Jews and the annihilation of the state of Israel and signals support for Hamas. I'm sure you all followed the case of Charlotte Church, who was attacked by the Daily Mail, the Jewish Chronicle, the Express, etc., who accused her of singing a genocidal song that is a direct call for the state of Israel to be destroyed, after she led a choir in a rendition of River to Sea at a church fundraiser for medical aid for Palestine. Of course, we know that the slogan, far from being controversial, reaffirms the right of return, the liberation of Palestine and the freedom of Palestinian people. And it's worth noticing here that attempts to prosecute people who use that chant in other European countries have been thrown out by the courts. Nevertheless, the strategy is to portray the slogan as hate speech, to equate it with equate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, and silence discussion around an advocacy for the Palestinian cause. Which brings me to my second point. Where does the media vilification lead in practice? Here we need to turn to policing, and I think we need to understand not policing just in terms of the Metropolitan Police or different police forces, but the systems of policing that are now embedded in the university, who are playing a crucial role in authorising the police to break up protests in campus. In the UK, we've seen, in terms of the Met and other police force, ever more restrictions and the use of escalating force in a carefully calibrated strategy to make it more difficult to march. The Terrorism Act 2000, which criminalised the expressions of opinions supportive of a banned organisation, has been utilised, as well as the Public Order Act. Ever-expanding number of conditions and penalties against the organisers of demonstrations. The government has also published a new Defending Democracy policing protocol and are seeking further legal changes which would introduce blanket bans on the holding of protests around specific locations and could also bar MPs for engaging with certain legal groups such as the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Are we going to see a situation in the UK where the state authorises only rallies on issues that the state supports? Hey, you know what? That's what we criticise Russia for doing, but that's where we are heading. I think when we look to what's happening on the US campuses, obviously we are all absolutely inspired. It's just been amazing, but the levels of police violence used there are terrifying. I think I saw a report about a police snipers on the roof at Emory University. We haven't seen that level of violence and armed response in Europe as yet, but in Italy, certainly the riot police have used truncheons to bludgeon high school students, and the German state have gone the furthest in using force, not just around pro-Palestine events, but to install saturation policing in Berlin around Arab diasporic communities. So, for instance, the Sonnenallee, known as Berlin's Arab Street, was subjected to the riot police being stationed on that street for 3 days in a row at the height of pro-Palestine protests. And of course, we've seen the suppression of the Palestine Congress, many of the organizers of which were Jewish. But I haven't got time to go into that in detail, but there's an excellent article in the London Review of Books by Olivier Giovetti. One thing that stands out from her report is a ratio of 10 police officers were used to every conference goer at the Palestine Congress. In Paris in the last couple of weeks, pro-Israeli demonstrators draped in Israeli and French flags organised a walk-in to a sit-in at the Sciences Po Institute, leading to fighting on the street. A walk-in at a Palestine pro-Palestine event by pro-Israeli supporters. Does that sound familiar? It sounds a little bit familiar to strategies that we've seen in the UK. And we can't overlook the fact that in our communities, there has been an increase in both Islamophobic attacks and anti-Semitic attacks. And this kind of activity is deeply worrying at a time when we need to unify in our communities and bring people together. The third point I mentioned at the beginning, I just want to go back to that. So important, the creation of new repressive norms around hate speech. That should concern us all. That's where the IHRA definition is key. It's the definition the media are using to present pro-Palestine demonstrations as hate rallies. Interestingly, in many of the articles that I've looked at, the go-to organisation they cite is the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. Hil Aked's book, Friends of Israel, the Backlash Against Palestine Solidarity, is, like, for me, the key fundamental text that I go back to all the time when I'm trying to understand the different tendencies within British Zionism. The British Society for Middle Eastern Studies has also warned that media attacks on anti-colonial scholarship is linked to the widespread adoption of the IHRA definition on campus. This is why I wanted to end with the terrible case of Dr. Naderi Shahub-Kevokian. And I think that there are people here who might have more up-to-date information about this. She is a Palestinian-Israeli professor who is part of a faculty at the Hebrew University, but she is also the global chair at the School of Law at St. Mary's, University of London. I don't know how to put this politely, but she has been arrested several times in Israel. She has been subjected to death threats on the basis of her academic work. She has suffered at least cruel and degrading treatment. She's been strip searched. There have been reports that she has also been tortured. The IRA supports our colleagues at the International State Crime Initiative and the 250 academics who have called on the Dean to take action to support Dr. Nadera Shahub, who is under great threat. At the moment, the university have expressed concern about her well-being, but they haven't condemned her arrest. So where are we? For me, this is where the hostile environment interacts, because she is both a overseas professor based at a British university, so she's subject to the hostile environment, you might say, that is in universities against those who haven't got full British citizenship. But she's also a Palestinian and a Palestinian Israeli citizen, so she's the victim of anti-Palestinian racism. So when the heads of our universities cannot even stand up for members of their own faculty, we need to ask ourselves where is the moral duty to act. I know for me that if ever I hear that somebody has been a victim of torture or cruel or degrading treatment, you have to act. If you don't act, it's like passing somebody by on the street who's seriously ill and just walking on the other side. She's under grave threat. I think this is terrifying stuff indeed. As Penny Greener-Iski has pointed out, her arrest sets a precedent for any academic who goes against a consensus in wartime. Terrifying stuff indeed. Social scientists against the hostile environment are needed more than ever before. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Liz. Another excellent talk. I've had a message from Emma, who would have been our third speaker, who is unwell and unable to join us, which means that we have plenty of time for questions and responses and comments. Liz needs to leave us by, I think, 15:15, about a bit more than half an hour, so we can maybe start with questions to her. In a second, I'm going to hand over to Anne, who's going to chair the discussion part. But before we do, just kind of a couple of things. I've put in the chat the link to the IRR News, where you can sign up to get mailings, and I've put a link to a petition for Nadera Shahu-Kevorkian, who, as Liz said, is a affiliated academic at Queen Mary University in London, and so is as Liz said, is our colleague as well as facing this persecution. So I'll hand over to Amber. I just want to say that kind of one of the key things that came out for me from the two presentations is the importance of connecting up what's going on in the UK with what's going on kind of across Europe and North America in terms of a trend of the way that the right is using the image of protest and the image of the protest to kind of drive forward a kind of repressive agenda, and how that agenda is always kind of framed in a racialized way. It always falls most heavily on those who have kind of precarious citizenship, but not those who are kind of most entangled in racialized forms of policing already. And the importance of kind of noting some of the key changes in legislation and policing practice that both Liz and Erin noted, which are kind of sweeping in year by year with kind of relatively little resistance. So I'll hand over to Anne, who is going to chair the discussion Q&A.
Thank you very much, Ben. And thank you so much, Erin and Liz. I think that those were just wonderful. They're just what we need now, presentations. And everybody, please either put up your hand and I'll make an effort to see you, although you're across many screens, or put some comments or questions in the chat, and I'll come to you in a little while. But for a start, could I please ask you to respond to each other and to think about, you know, the ways in which you've shown, for example, how the hostile environment permeates all the issues that you're talking about at the moment, and what you think you would like to ask the other speaker. So if we could start perhaps with Erin, if you respond to Liz first and then Liz to Erin, that would be great. And then we'll come to questions from the group.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, I have to say I was really sort of moved by what Liz was saying, and I think it's really important to highlight not just these policies and these more overt acts, pieces of legislation and statements, but the system they reinforce, and they that extends well beyond before this moment of crisis and will extend well beyond, re-entrenching power and preventing both the resistance to the injustices that we're seeing, but also, and violence we're seeing, but also the way in which they, Liz drew them out internationally, and the way in which that kind of exposes the sort of the global nature of them, and the way in which they can impact solidarity across borders, which I think is crucially important, because what we're talking about in one instance is sort of like, you know, the right to protest in Britain, but we're also talking about Palestinian solidarity, and we're talking about migration and the impact on people at the sharpest end of these borders, these forms of policing, etc. And I think it's also one of the other things that I was really kind of and it's really important to highlight the impact. We're talking about, you know, people in one country or another, but the way in which Palestinians in all countries and all places and between them are the most affected at the sharpest end. I think if I was to ask a question, I'd want to know, I'd like sort of like, I've been thinking a lot about this lately, about the way in which the definition of anti-Semitism has played into this, which Liz pointed out at the very beginning, and how we fight against that, how we manage to articulate a form of hate without giving it up to its weaponization or a misrepresentation of it. Because I think one of the things it does is it not only justifies what Israel is doing it erases and silences other Jews. It also divides and rules, and is designed often to undermine solidarity.
Liz.
Yeah, Erin's taken the wind out of my sails because I was busy thinking of a question, and it's like I think my question is more or less the same as the question is thrown at me. So, and I was hoping he would answer that. Now I have to go first. So, I think for me, the important thing, the important thing is that the way that we respond to this whole weaponization of, we could say it's not just a weaponization of anti-Semitism, we've also seen a weaponization of anti-racism. I mean, you'd think that the Conservative Party were the most anti-racist party in the country, you know, in their declarations about how they're not going to tolerate anti-Semitism. So in a sense, and the Labour Party as well, I mean, equally, the political parties have weaponized anti-racism, and in the process, they have degraded it. They have exploited and expropriated our struggles against racism, because it wasn't political parties who opposed racism who changed the culture in this country for the better. So, you know, there's a bigger thing going on here. It is very Orwellian. But I think the answer is that we have to have universal positions on racism. We have to start from the universal, and we have to say that there is no way that you can be against one form of racism and be a little bit, you know, a little bit racist in another area. You know, Sivanandan, who was my mentor when we used to discuss this, he would always say, you can't be a little bit pregnant. That would be always his way of describing what I'm trying to describe in a long, convoluted way. So I think that, and that's why I think Hil Akked's book that I mentioned earlier is excellent, because it provides a template for fighting anti-Muslim racism, anti-Arab racism, and anti-Semitism at the same time. So that's, I suppose, the point I would make is the need for a universal anti-racism. And also, you know, to really go against any creation of a hierarchy around which racisms are better or worse than the others, and not to compete, you know, not to compete, to unify and to express empathy and show solidarity is so important. So I guess the question that I wanted to ask Aaron was around what he said around the context being the new definitions of extremism. And to ask him, you see, it's really, really strange, because these new definitions are actually not in the law. But they've become quasi-laws. They've become norms. And as you know, Carl Schmitt always, you know, has said, he who sets the norms, it's interesting, he who sets the norms sets the rules. And I mean, what I think terrifies me most is the conformity and the brain. I mean, I really feel that people are being brainwashed. So, you know, and we're sort of sleepwalking into this utterly conformist society where, you know, perfectly nice people, you can't have a conversation with them because they have been brainwashed. And so, yeah, I thought I'd just ask him to comment on that sort of quasi-law angle.
Thank you, Liz. Aaron, back to you.
Yeah, no, I'm happy. I just wanted to say, like, I mean, I couldn't agree more about the solidarity. I was in a discussion about this a little while ago, and I'm seeing people point out to explain anti-Semitism, and they're like, you know, we're seeing, you know, an insult on the street, we're seeing marches, we're seeing October 7th, we're seeing this, we're seeing that. And I'm always like, if you can connect all these things, surely you can connect multiple racisms to try in your analysis of things. But to go to your question, I mean, I have the same feeling and suspicion as you. I mean, I think it is brainwashing. I think it felt like a very dangerous example of chancing it, like just saying like, look here, I'm going to throw this out here. But the problem is that when you throw this out, when you throw this new definition out there in a way that is already securitized and already has prevent in operation and recently reaffirmed by Shawcross, it makes it material. It really does. It really can have an impact. And I think that's very insidious and very dangerous. One of the things that I've been sort of like thinking about a lot lately was the way in which, and this goes to your point about weaponization of racism, because or anti-racism, because this is how I've been thinking about it. There has been such a disproportionate focus and securitization of Muslims. And many people have been yelling about the far right, the far right, the far right. And there's no doubt the far right's been active and it's a threat. I don't necessarily think it's necessarily more of a threat than the state which mainstreams its ideas. But they tend to throw those criticisms on a bone every once in a while by going, look, we're going after the far right too. And I think they do that, and then they quickly, the moment passes, and they go after everyone else who might be anti-racist on the left and have criticized it previously. And I think that, in a sense, when they say that, they're telling that to prevent officers. They're telling that to the media. They're telling that to the activists themselves. And they're telling that to the far right. And we saw that in its worst, in its really bad form, with the way in which the far right police and other forces went after Antifa and Black Lives Matter in the United States, in which you can end up legitimizing and encouraging vigilantism. And I think it's very dangerous. And I don't necessarily think it's, people who work on terrorism and extremism are obsessed with definitions. Like, is it the correct definition? Is it the correct definition? And they have very little critique of the systems and structures and institutions themselves. But the fact is that those definitions are played around with for flexibility and mobility of these agencies. And I think that's very scary.
Thank you very much. Great questions and comments there. I'm going to start with a question from Ulrika V10, and I'm going to invite her to actually ask it herself, although I could read it out if she's unable to. But Ulrika, are you there? Thank you. You're muted still.
Can't see myself anyway.
Yes, we can see
So
you.
yeah, thanks both for your contributions, which is, I think, very spot on. My question, because I mean, apart from living in Northern Ireland and much more exposed to the situation in Ireland as a republic, which is very, very different. So my question to both of you was like, do you have an idea how to explain the similarities between Germany and the UK/Britain on the one hand, and other European countries where there was, not only in terms of the presence in the streets, so London and Dublin would be probably very similar in that regard, but also a different position towards Palestine and so forth. Just talking about Europe, continental Europe, EU, which is Ireland and Spain, I have in mind here. So there are differences. And to my knowledge, of course, in Germany, there was the strongest, let's say, responses. And I like this kind of intervention with the brainwashing. As a German myself, though living in the UK since 2002, I noticed that it becomes increasingly difficult to speak to some of my friends or people I know in Germany about these issues. So there's like a level of internalized, let's say, philosemitism/state love I find really very difficult to comprehend. So, but that was my question. And as the last bit of that, do you see this kind of normalization of the far right also linking into what's happening now, the kind of authoritarian brainwashing responses. Again, Ireland rather a latecomer to these developments. So I would be interested to hear what you think about it. Thanks.
Thank you. Can we start with Liz, please?
Yeah, Ulrika, thank you so much for that question and intervention. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's hard when you talk of Europe, of course, there are differences. Spain and Ireland are definitely the exceptions. I'm not sure, but I see any other countries. There is a little bit, perhaps, a little bit of difference in Norway, particularly around the UNRWA situation, probably because of the role it's always played in peace processes. I would say it's ambiguous in Belgium. It's not as heavy as it is in Germany and the UK. I completely identified what you said about conversations with friends in Germany. I have the same problem. Unfortunately, the problem is on the left as much as it is on the right. There is an ambiguity, and they want to, a lot of people who have been my close comrades. I don't think I can talk to them about it, which is very, very difficult because it's very difficult to remain friends with people who find it hard to call out a genocide and find it hard to speak out against apartheid. What is the point of the left? What is the point of the left? I would say Germany and UK, it's very interesting. And I think we're only really beginning to understand this. I think and probably France is, I think we are so imbricated in terms of capitalism with Israel. There are so many interests. Israel is seen as part of the West. And so I think there is an element here, which is, the arms industry. Clearly, Germany is the second seller of arms to Israel after the United States. UK has close arms connections. German situation, I think people will talk about, of course, German guilt. And it's quite interesting that, you asked about the far right, that we see how Alternative for Germany, the far right party, electoral party, have been the most, the people who've capitalized most on the whole discussions around memory. And their whole argument is that we need to close the guilt. And actually being aggressive supporters of Israel is a way of closing the guilt. It's also interesting, and the work of Anna Yunus is very important here, her work in Germany. And she is the one who explained, I think I listened to her in a podcast, but the AfD were the first party in the German parliament to call for the banning of the BDS movement, a way of closing the guilt. But I don't think, I've actually reviewed what I think about Germany, because at first for a long time I've been involved in anti-fascist politics with the anti-fascist German movement, and a long time that I felt that many of my friends have this sort of overwhelming guilt about the Holocaust. But now I feel that the state has been very clever at manipulating that guilt and brainwashing people, and the state has, in the post-war period, has been reintegrated into the Western security apparatus through its support of Israel. So I think there's something far more actually shoddy going on in Germany.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Very worrying. Yeah, thanks.
Aaron.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I'm horrified at what's going on in Germany, and I keep on thinking about the way in which discussions about racism in Britain, when it is acknowledged, there has been a bit of a sort of pattern where something like the Holocaust Education Trust becomes sort of mobilized to teach about racism in schools, or to, for example, deal with football fan racism. It was an example of Chelsea a number of years ago when they were talking about sending racists to Auschwitz and to Germany and to German concentration camps in order to learn about the implications of racism. And what struck me there is you could probably just stay here if you want to learn about the history of racism, and you could do research on, well, British history. But there's something in it for me, the way in which racism in Britain has been displaced onto Germany or America, but and Britain denies it and deals with its kind of, or silences or compartmentalizes its guilt for historical racism and places it on Germany, and Germany sort of has mobilized that guilt and made it a feature of sort of like authoritarianism, renewed authoritarianism. And there's something in that for me, because one of the things that I experienced with, I was at an event where they were talking about prevent officers were there talking about sending fascists to concentration camps to learn. And I was thinking of the oddness of that, the way in which that sort of event becomes what me and Aurélien Mondon refer to as sort of like the paradigm of illiberal racism. It becomes the lesson through which you hammer, you can deny racism, or you can hammer things that kind of that are unacceptable. For myself, in terms of talking to people, I mean, I found Ireland is a very good example of that, despite the sort of the rise of the far right there. But in Scotland, for a whole host of reasons, I never thought I would find sort of England as an example of something so where it's easy to discuss, particularly with what we're seeing with going on in government and in the media. But I did have, I'm Canadian by birth, and I've recently had an experience of talking to Canadians about it, or not talking to Canadians about it. And while there isn't a sort of like far right mobilization in Canada, there's a form of liberalism that refuses to acknowledge the possibility of a genocide, that sees anti-Semitism as the racism that's going to be fought. And I found it almost impossible to speak to people. I know there are occupations and mobilizations, and as we know, Naomi Klein's written some really great stuff about it. But I'm finding it very hard to grasp and have a conversation. And I'm saying this as someone whose family arrived in Canada as refugees from Nazism and as Holocaust survivors. That is on the back of Canada's none is too many policy. And I think in a sense, Canada, I know you didn't ask about Canada, but it's still dealing with its guilt about not letting Jewish refugees in. And that's overlaid by a liberalism and a sort of like, I think very much like here, a sort of idea that there's a Jewish vote, and that Jewish vote is pro-Israel.
Thank you very much. Can I call on Don Flynn now to ask your question, please? Don?
Yeah, just turning on my...
Yeah, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks, Anne. And thanks to the speakers. Really great introductions to the themes. My question's about another form of protest, the really sharp end of it, I think, civil disobedience. And it occurs to me, particularly listening to the news this morning about people who are potentially slated for removal to Rwanda or going on the lam, quite unsurprisingly, in my view. But that does mean that I think the anti-racist movement is probably going to have to up its game over the course of the next few months, not only to be on the streets organising demonstrations against discrimination and against racist immigration laws, but actually providing material support for people who are evading the clutches of the state. And I wonder to what extent we are making the point that this is a political act. It's an act which contributes to strengthening of democracy in the countries in which we live, and therefore the state authorities have to deal with it on those terms. It's not criminality or delinquency or anything of that sort, but it is a considered action which is justified in terms of the magnitude of what we're being confronted with. Is that possible in the context of the immigration debate, for example? And I think probably the Gaza war as well in the UK, which is also challenged with civil disobedience issues. And I think in particular, are there examples, Liz might know this from her vast knowledge of what's going on in movements in Europe in particular, and perhaps Aaron with regard to North America, but are there examples of mass movements, mass protest movements, which have taken on civil disobedience and have it's contributed to the momentum of those movements?
Okay, thank you, Don. And we'll start with Liz again. I'm aware that you'll need to leave in 10 minutes, so if we could.
I think that I don't think that we can say that there are mass movements around civil disobedience, but I think what we can say is that there are movements and individuals who are setting a lead and showing a way forward. And in a way, I mean, maybe we might not call it civil disobedience, but I mean, a precursor to that has been the amazing work that has been done by search and rescue NGOs in the Mediterranean. I mean, that sort of work has been inspirational. And in a sense, yes, it was civil disobedience because they were going against the law and the norm. So, I mean, yes, I mean, there are individual acts, there are groups like Palestine, is it Palestine Action who have done all the work around the arms trade. But I think at the moment in Europe, I would say it's more a people setting the lead, or organisations setting the lead. I do think that what we're seeing on campus in the United States is a civil disobedience moment. People are comparing it to the Vietnam War. The bravery of those young people is phenomenal. And there are parallels definitely in Europe. I mean, we saw that I've been following, what's happening in Paris. Then they're literally the protests at the Sciences Po stopped, and the Sorbonne started immediately. And apparently the Prime Minister actually asked the police to clear the courtyard of the Sorbonne. So these students are up against it, and I have the greatest respect for these young people and what they're doing on campus. And it is a civil disobedience moment in the sense it's a refusal to conform. It might not be, be analytically or intellectually thought out as in the tradition of civil disobedience at the moment, but it's a instinctive reaction is that this is disgusting what's happening. We're seeing a genocide, and we refuse to conform to this stifling environment. So it's very positive.
Thank you. And Aaron, could you come in?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely what we're saying. I mean, for me, it's absolutely like so heroic and inspirational. I think in terms of your question about it being political, I think what's quite interesting and insidious at this moment is the way in which we have this increasing authoritarianism on the back of a reactionary moment, which seeks to kind of almost like to criminalize, securitize, and treat these movements and these activists as a threat to the nation, Western civilization, whatever, in ways that somehow displace their importance to democracy and their politics and make them criminal. And then turn that criminality into something so threatening and dangerous to the existence of our nation and our culture and whatnot, that that really I think has been used in ways to justify further crackdowns and further sort of like dehumanization and repression. I was quite amazed because, of course, my thought when I saw what was going on in the U.S., particularly the snipers there were snipers at a university in Ohio, as well as Emory, and I'm in Kent State, and I have sort of Neil Young's Ohio playing in my head. I was talking to some sort of old high school friends, and we were on different sides of these debates. And the discussion about like why protesting Vietnam was right and why this is absolutely the opposite shocked me. And I can see the way in which the legacy of protest, which had been sort of like a lesson from history in American and Canadian society, has been so lost and twisted. And that makes me very quite fearful. But in terms of what it can allow to be unleashed, because that it's been decided it's so wrong and dangerous. I do have hope, because the spread of these movements is just amazing to me. And I'm hoping it continues, and I'm really hoping for sort of the safety of people.
Thank you. Thanks, Aaron. And because time is moving on for Liz, I wonder if you could just in a way pick up that theme of hope and perhaps leave us with what you're hoping for and what we can do to move towards more hopeful positions.
Yeah, but thank you, Anne. I think in doing that, I think I'll also respond to a question I've just seen in the chat around the right to protest and why disabled people are being bullied. The hope comes in terms of the unity that we can forge when we see that the same state that is creating moral panics around protesters, around migrants, around disabled people, around people on welfare benefits, around the homeless. The hope comes when we unify our struggles and we come together, which is what Don was also hinting at with his point that we've got to up our game. We've got to up our game, not just in terms of the intensity in which we respond to the issues that face us in our particular area of activism or scholarship and scholar activism, but by spreading out and unifying with people in other areas. I was incredibly upset this week, the last couple of weeks, when I heard Sunak's speech saying that we need welfare reform. It's the end of, people can't have, I don't know if these exact words were used, but it was the dog whistle about people are getting something for nothing. And it's, do you know what? Divide and rule, them and us, people get something for nothing. It's always the same. And we need to come together. Hope, the genocide in Gaza, we all know, everybody knows it's a genocide. And don't believe that people in power don't know it's a genocide. They know full well it's a genocide. So many people, particularly young people, have seen right through it. There is the hope. We talked about the brainwashing, but the hope comes from the people who haven't been brainwashed.
Thank you very much, Liz. And can I ask everybody to thank Liz, who now has to go to the end of her annual general meeting. And thank you very much for coming and giving us so much when you really should have been elsewhere. So
thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. And we'll continue, of course. That, Aaron, puts all the onus on you. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
I'm a bit nervous.
so I wonder if I can invite Zoe to ask her question, please, if you're still here. Zoe? Okay, I'll just sort of read out at least a bit of the question. She says that I'm also interested in why the people of the West are so engaged in this conflict more than other conflicts in the world. Why don't the same people fight more for the injustices in their own country? For example, how many protests on consecutive Saturdays were in the UK against the destruction of the NHS or against institutional racism, etc.? This while they can also protest against their country sending weapons to countries in conflict or taking advantage of poor countries to make a profit. Why did academics and ordinary citizens let politicians legislate restrictions on freedom, to mention just one of the few ongoing issues? So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is, be careful with my words. I'm not saying it's not, I don't think there's attention on this, but not other things. I don't think that's the case. I think that there is organizing and activism and academics writing and opposing a multitude of injustices and inequalities every day. And I think part and parcel of what is going on now and what we're talking about this afternoon, this evening, is about making connections between these things. Genocide in Gaza and racism and the hostile environment. So I think that these connections are being drawn, and there isn't an isolated case that one thing gets attention and other things don't. I think, in fact, that the NHS there's a lot of discussion about that. This has been a slow march of neoliberalism, cuts, conservatism, and the politics of reaction that we've all been talking about the whole time. But I also think what you're seeing in these weekly protests is the absolute anger, fear, and despair about a genocide. There is a genocide going on that is and demands this level of attention.
Okay, thank you very much. I can't see any further questions in the chat. But now there is one. There's Glyn Secker. Glyn, do you want to ask yourself, or do you want me to read this out?
Yeah, no, I'll ask. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
I just wanted to pick up on a very important point that Liz made, and it's a great shame that she had to go. And rather than, I'd like to have asked her to expand on it, but I'll see what I can do. I won't be anywhere as adequate as Liz. I think we need an explanation as to why this attack on the Palestinians is so extraordinary in its ferocity, how the power of America and Germany and Britain and so on are quite sort of unabashed about pursuing this genocide when it's playing out on real time on Al Jazeera. Everybody could see, and you would expect it to create a real crisis in liberal democracy. But as Liz was explaining, the press and the mainstream media have got a handle on that. But it still seems to me not adequate to, which I've done many times before. So we'll look at the vested interests. Of course, they're really significant. But if you step back and look at American engagement in the Middle East, in that whole theatre from the 1950s, when it really started to back Israel, it was at a time when it realized that the key to the whole of the development of American modern industrial society and QED, the American dream, stood squarely on oil. And also, of course, on the Suez Canal as a main international trading route. And Nixon was once asked, why did he give Israel so much money? And he said it's cheaper than the Sixth Fleet. And it's because of that centrality to oil in the whole of the economies of the West, and the threat that Palestinian liberation could pose to that, that they're so brazen about and desperate about what they're doing. And it's categorically different in a way to apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid in South Africa came to an end because of one, obviously, all the organized resistance, and particularly the organization of the ANC, but also it was an outdated form of modern economy. But it wasn't core to the Western economy, whereas the oil states and provision of oil is. And so I describe the relationship between America and Israel as a symbiotic relationship. And it's very powerful all the way through, ideologically as well as economically and financially. It's on the back of that that the Israeli lobby rides. It's not because of the lobby rides on the back of that economic thing. And so the question is then, one, am I overstating this, Aaron, do you think? And secondly, a much more difficult question, what do we do about it?
Okay, thank you, Glyn and Aaron. A very simple question for you to address.
All right, well, I'm gonna answer it. Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree about that history and the forces in play, but I think that's long been established. I think what's going on now is I think a product of several things, but I think the way in which the dehumanization and just negation of any possibility of what they call peace, after this whole kind of like, the past number of decades about peace accord, I wish there were peace in the Middle East, blah, blah, blah. I think there's a complete, I think there's an abandonment of that sentiment. And I think Netanyahu knows that. I think America knows it. And I think that he's being allowed to do whatever he wants, because I don't think they thought that the opposition, resistance, protest would be there, not just from civil society, but also from other governments. And I think they're right about the other governments or other states. And I think this has to do also with sort of like political power and political relations and interdependence, which is also economic. But I also think that Netanyahu is looking after his own far-right project, his own political and sort of, I guess, legal skin. And I also, I do think they want to recolonize it. I do think they want to get rid of that population. They want to have it river to the sea. And I think there's an ideological commitment to it as well. Now, there is an economic function as well, or benefit for them in the way they're selling off real estate. And we've seen this in across North America with like real estate events, and I mean, to my absolute bloody horror, they've been taking place in synagogues in some cases, including one around the corner from where I was raised. So I think the economic and the ideological sort of like, they're not always the same, but they're intersecting in different ways. But I think it's a conjunctural thing at this point in time, and I think it does depend on the abandonment of hope and the the prioritization of who and what matters in this world, as we've been increasingly across the West, for example, become increasingly reactionary and fascist.
Thank you very much.
I didn't ask what can be done, but I don't. I'm hopeful, and more protests, but I don't have a solution to them.
Okay, thank you. That was really quite a tall order. If you could sort it out, we'd all be grateful, though.
We'll talk later.
Okay. Kyrinda Mali, could you?
Yeah. No, I was going to say.
I can't hear you very well. I don't know if other people can. Can you be louder, please?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
Yeah. I was going to say to Glenn that if we get like some of the election going, like for the essential people, and like if there is a no like a split, if people have split, then Palestine or Israel will get involved. We, as the United Kingdom, we should not get involved in people's country. I don't know why, like, our government is getting involved in other people's country when it's not even our responsibility. And, like, depend on your oil, right? We are involved in the Japan or China, whatever it is. We should do it. I mean, if they are disabled, right, if we look at the disability, yourself as a disability, you should not be any other people involved, correct?
Okay,
No,
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
We haven't got much time left. So so your question is really about, you know, we shouldn't be getting involved in other people's countries.
Yeah.
And so it's an electoral issue. Aaron, do you have any comments on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't agree. I think on several levels. I mean, one is that the responsibility through the history of colonialism and the establishment of Israel on the back of the Mandate. But I also think that there is an unequal world that we in certain countries benefit from and reproduce and reinforce, and there's an obligation. But I also think it's because people's lives and well-being matter. But I also think that, like, I don't want to chalk too much up to the electoral, because I mean, I think we have two parties who are against migration and against stopping a genocide. I don't think that let's leave it to elections. But I think the other thing is that omitting yourself from becoming involved is not being involved. Omitting yourself from taking a stand in a genocide is allowing and enabling that genocide. At the same time, it is a position, and I do think it matters. And I'm really sort of pained about how governments are not taking a stand against this. It's absolutely, I guess it's shocking, but not surprising.
Thank you very much. I can't see any different questions in the chat now, and we are near the end. And I think so much has come up that has been absolutely crucial and really helpfully brought together. So maybe I will just, in closing, pick out a couple of points. And one of them is that I think very much came from you, Aaron, and the way that you wove things together is that we have to think in complex ways that join up all sorts of things. So join up government here and elsewhere, join up histories, join up the complexity of different racisms and so on. And that we have to think through the law as well as thinking about everyday practices and where they come from and what underlies them as well as their impacts. So that, you know, you're encouraging us really to try to think about that complexity in order to be able to see the hope that you mentioned earlier. And I think certainly Liz would agree with that from what she said, but I very much also liked her thinking about the universal opposition to racisms in their plurality, so that if we're interested in anti-racism, one of the things that we have to do is to see racisms as all to be opposed and as one way in which we can oppose as well something that you were both concerned about, which is thinking about how charges of anti-Semitism can really diffuse action and stop people seeing things in complex ways and doing things and so on. And another issue I think that both of you help us to see even better is that not only do we have to understand things, but that we have to act, and that action at the moment is really absolutely crucial if we are to make change, and that action has to recognize globalism and global histories, as well as you know, being located in you know, our parties here at the moment, and to think more widely. So Aaron, can I give you the last word? Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we end?
Well, I think you put it together like I'm really, way better than I could have. Yeah, I mean, I think I just want to reiterate that I think we need to think in complex ways and make these connections, because one of the most dangerous things that's undermining resistance, protest, solidarity is the divide, is the dehumanization of people and the divide and rule. And I do think we need to sort of stand together in both our analyses and our actions.
Thank you very much. That's a lovely way to end. Can I invite us all to thank Aaron very much for all the work he's put into this and all the interesting and important things he said. Thank you.